In October 2025, Battlefield 6 sold 7 million copies in its first 3 days. It went on to sell more than 20 million copies total, generate an estimated $1.4 billion in revenue, and become the best-selling game in the United States for the entire year, dethroning Call of Duty for the first time in 16 consecutive years. Electronic Arts called it the biggest launch in franchise history. 5 months later, Electronic Arts laid off the people who made it. That's not a typo. That's the story. Welcome to Failed Games. I'm going to tell you exactly how Electronic Arts took one of gaming's greatest comeback stories and turned it into yet another cautionary tale. To understand why Battlefield 6's success matters, you need to understand what came before it. For a long time, Battlefield was the only serious alternative to Call of Duty in the military shooter space. Not a clone, an alternative. Larger maps, vehicle warfare, environmental destruction that could level entire buildings mid-match. Squad-based gameplay that rewarded coordination over individual kills. DICE, the Swedish studio that built the franchise, understood something fundamental, that the chaos of a real battlefield, the noise, the scale, the unpredictability, was itself the game. Battlefield 3 in 2011 and Battlefield 4 in 2013 were the high water marks. Battlefield 3 sold over 15 million copies and introduced the Frostbite engine's full destructive potential to a mainstream audience. The Siege of Shanghai skyscraper collapse became one of the defining multiplayer moments of that console generation. Battlefield 4, despite launching in a broken state that triggered a class action lawsuit, was patched into one of the best multiplayer shooters ever made and sold more than 12 million copies. The community loved it so much that players were still filling servers a decade later. These games built a fanbase that was fiercely loyal, not to EA, but to what Battlefield represented when it was done right. They remembered what it felt like when the franchise was great. That memory is important because it is the reason Battlefield 6 sold 20 million copies, and it is the reason the layoffs hurt so much. Then came the drift. Battlefield Hardline in 2015 abandoned military warfare for a cops and robbers theme nobody asked for. Battlefield 5 in 2018 launched into a public relations firestorm after a developer told critics of the game's marketing, "Don't like it, don't buy it." A significant portion of the audience took that advice. The game sold well below Electronic Arts' expectations. By the time Battlefield 2042 arrived in November 2021, the franchise was already on shaky ground. 2042 was supposed to be the reset. Instead, it was the collapse. The game launched on November 19th, 2021 in a state that was charitably unfinished. Bugs were everywhere. The netcode was broken. Matches were plagued by hit registration failures and server instability. The new specialist system replaced the beloved class structure with individual hero characters, a design decision that stripped away the squad identity that had defined Battlefield for 20 years. There was no single-player campaign. The maps were enormous but hollow, designed for spectacle rather than gameplay. Players in some regions could not find enough people to fill a match. On Steam, Battlefield 2042 peaked at just over 100,000 concurrent players at launch, a fraction of what the franchise's reputation warranted. Within 30 days, it had lost 80% of that player base. The game became a symbol of everything wrong with modern AAA development. Massive budget, corporate interference, shipped before it was ready, and fundamentally misaligned with what the audience actually wanted. EA eventually patched Battlefield 2042 into a more functional state, but the damage was done. The franchise's reputation was in ruins. This is where you'd expect the story to end, but Electronic Arts made an unusual decision. They decided to try again, and this time they went all in. Reports from July 2025 revealed that Electronic Arts had invested over $400 million in the development of Battlefield 6. spread across 4 studios: DICE in Stockholm, Criterion Games in Guildford, Motive Studio in Montreal, and Ripple Effect Studios in Los Angeles. This was the largest development effort in the franchise's history, and it came at a cost beyond money. Developers reportedly took up to 9 months off due to burnout during production. Electronic Arts also reportedly set an internal target of reaching more than 100 million players. To put that in perspective, Fortnite at its peak had around 350 million registered accounts, but it took years to build that audience. Counter-Strike 2 sits at roughly 30 million monthly players. The entire Battlefield franchise had sold approximately 90 million copies across its entire lifetime. Electronic Arts was asking one game to exceed the franchise's entire history in a single release cycle. Developers who spoke to reporters described the target as something very few of them believed was achievable. This detail matters enormously for what comes later. But here's the thing, the game actually worked. Battlefield 6 launched on October 10th, 2025. On Steam alone, it peaked at over 747,000 concurrent players, a franchise record by a massive margin. Critics praised the return to large-scale warfare, improved gunplay, and map design that felt like Battlefield again. EA's own press release declared it the biggest launch in franchise history, and for once, the marketing wasn't lying. 7 million copies in 3 days, 20 million by December. It was the best-selling game in the United States for the full year of 2025, ahead of NBA 2K26, Borderlands 4, and for the first time ever, Call of Duty. If you grew up playing Battlefield 3 or Battlefield 4, this felt like justice. The franchise had come back from the dead. If you're enjoying this breakdown, now is a great time to subscribe. We cover exactly these stories, the franchises that were great, the moments they fell apart, and the decisions that made it happen. Hit subscribe and you won't miss the next one. Then the cracks started showing. Despite the record launch, Battlefield 6's player retention began collapsing almost immediately. The reasons were well documented by the community. The maps were too small for the scale of warfare Battlefield promised. Players described matches as meat grinders, close-quarters infantry combat that felt like a Call of Duty clone rather than the large-scale, combined arms warfare that had defined the franchise. The destruction mechanics that had differentiated Battlefield from every other shooter were diminished compared to older titles. Vehicle gameplay had been marginalized. Season 2 was delayed after overwhelming player feedback about unresolved issues, breaking what the game's lead developer had called the smooth launch momentum. The community's message was consistent and clear. This does not feel like Battlefield. Make it feel like Battlefield. And then, in December 2025, EA added what appeared to be AI-generated cosmetics to the game's store, a weapon sticker that showed the telltale signs of generative AI, distorted text, anatomically impossible details, the unmistakable fingerprints of a model that does not understand what it is drawing. This was particularly damaging because EA had explicitly promised before launch that no generative AI art would appear in the game. Players who had paid $60 to $70 for the game and were being asked to spend more on cosmetics were now being sold what they described as AI garbage. The backlash was immediate and significant. By the time EA announced layoffs in March 2026, Battlefield 6's Steam peak had fallen from over 747,000 to approximately 67,000 concurrent players, a decline of over 90% in 5 months. The game had dropped to position 34 on Steam's concurrent player charts, sitting below titles like Team Fortress 2, Stardew Valley, and Euro Truck Simulator 2. And then, Electronic Arts laid off the developers. DICE, Criterion, Motive, and Ripple Effect, all 4 studios that had built the game, were hit with cuts. Electronic Arts said their justification was resource optimization and alignment in response to player retention challenges. Read that again. The game had sold 20 million copies and generated $1.4 billion in revenue. And Electronic Arts' response to the retention problem was to fire the people responsible for fixing it. The logic, if you can call it that, appears to be this. Electronic Arts had set a target of 100 million players. The game sold 20 million copies. In Electronic Arts' internal accounting, that might look like a failure, not because the game underperformed by any reasonable industry standard, but because it fell short of an internal target that was, by the developer's own admission, nearly impossible to begin with. Electronic Arts appears to have measured a record-breaking success against a fantasy benchmark, found it wanting, and responded accordingly. What makes this genuinely tragic is that the problems driving players away were fixable. The community had been specific and consistent. Bigger maps, more destruction, less monetization pressure, fix the netcode, stop making it feel like Call of Duty. These are content and design problems. They require developers, the exact resource Electronic Arts just cut. The history of Battlefield is, in many ways, the history of Electronic Arts' relationship with its own franchises. The series has always oscillated between triumph and disaster, with periods of success followed by decisions that squandered the goodwill. Battlefield 3 and Battlefield 4 built a loyal audience. Hardline and Battlefield 5 eroded it. 2042 nearly destroyed it. Battlefield 6 rebuilt it, and then Electronic Arts dismantled the team that did the rebuilding. The tragedy is not just that Electronic Arts made a bad business decision. It is that they had everything they needed: a game that worked, an audience that came back, a franchise that had proven, against all odds, that it still had something to offer. Battlefield 6 dethroned Call of Duty. It sold 20 million copies. It brought back players who had written the franchise off years ago. And Electronic Arts' response was to fire the people who made it happen. That is the Battlefield story. Not a story about a game that failed, but a story about a publisher that could not recognize success when it was standing right in front of them. A publisher that set an impossible target, watched a game exceed every reasonable expectation, and then punished the people responsible because the impossible target was not met. The franchise survived 2042. It may not survive this. If this video made you feel something, if you remember when Battlefield was great, or if you were just angry on behalf of the developers who built something people loved, leave a comment below. Tell me which failed franchise you want covered next. Halo? Mass Effect? Diablo? I read every comment, and your suggestions genuinely shape what we cover. Subscribe if you have not already, and I will see you in the next one.